What is your name?
Jeff Emmick.
How old were you when the Beatles were popular? Like, how old were you when you were introduced to them?
Well, they were popular when I was born in 1965, but I kind of remember when I was maybe 5, 6 years old that my mom had her stereo set up in our basement in our house in Greenfield, Indiana. And if I remember right, I think their label was Apple Records at that point. At least in the U.S., it was Apple Records because I remember some records, 45s that she had that had an Apple for Apple Records, and occasionally she would go down and listen. Unfortunately, we don't seem to have those old 45s anymore, although I've got some 45 records from when I was a kid, but no actual Beatles records.
Okay. Where did you live at about this time?
Well, Greenfield, Indiana, through the kind of the late '60s and early '70s.
Okay. Where did you go to school?
I initially went to Greenfield. I went to Greenfield, Lincoln Park Elementary in Greenfield, and then Greenfield Middle School, and then we moved to the south side of Indianapolis to the Center Grove school system, and I went to Center Grove Middle School and then Center Grove High School, except my junior year of high school, and we'll talk a little bit about that because that's where my real appreciation for the Beatles came in.
What year did you graduate?
I graduated from high school in 1984.
Okay. What is your earliest memory of the Beatles?
Well, I think I already mentioned that. Probably my earliest memory is my mom playing 45s on the record player in the basement. And I know she had a couple Beatles 45s, although I was so young I can't remember what the songs were now. But my real appreciation for the Beatles came when I was a junior in high school. I spent a year, our whole family spent a year in the United Kingdom when I was a junior in high school. And I think the Beatles were kind of making a resurgence at that point, at least the popularity of their music in kind of the early 1980s. And a whole new generation was becoming, I think, was becoming reintroduced to the Beatles. And living in the United Kingdom, there was made it even more special. And then I think, as you know, Maria, we've talked about this many times, that actually one of the Beatles' stepdaughters, Ringo Starr, his stepdaughter, Francesca Barberini, actually went to the school in England with us. We used to pick her up in our little minivan bus. And that was actually Barbara Bach's daughter when Ringo Starr was married to Barbara Bach. So Ringo Starr used to come to middle school concerts at TASIS, the American school in Switzerland in the UK. And we had a chance to at least see him. I never met him myself, but we were with his stepdaughter every day on the bus for an entire year. I think that's when my love for the Beatles started. And in fact, I think that's when I bought my first Beatles album. So this is, I think, the only album that I bought when I was in the UK. It's Gramophone Records. You can see the symbol on the back. This is a record that I bought in probably 1982 or 1983, and it's a collection of Beatles oldies. So it's got almost, it's got a good number of their number one hits on the album, and still in pretty good shape too, as you can see. So that was probably my first Beatles album. But even before that, going back to the early 80s, I think all of us that grew up in the early 80s were Wings fans, and I found in my 45 collection an original 45 of With a Little Luck from Wings, and I think that's dated 1982, if I could find the right date here. That might have actually been in the 70s. But so I was a Wings fan before I really became a Beatles fan, then in the early 1980s.
Okay. So who introduced you to the Beatles?
I don't know that I can remember, other than some awareness when I was little, as I mentioned earlier, with my mom. I think I was probably introduced through friends in my high school in England that one year, and just hearing songs on the radio and living in the United Kingdom. I don't think you can escape exposure to the Beatles, and that's where I really became interested in them.
What Beatle records or other merchandise did you buy?
Just what I showed you here, but then I think my love for the Beatles continued into high school or into college after graduation from high school, and I watched and eagerly awaited the release of Beatles albums on CD. And for those that were around at the time of the introduction of the CD player and CDs, if I remember correctly, Michael Jackson bought all the rights to the Beatles albums, and he was not supportive of releasing them on CD. He was a purist of the vinyl sound, if I remember all my history correctly, and didn't want them released on CD. And it took quite a while after the introduction of a lot of major albums on CD before the first Beatles albums were actually released. And I was in Crawfordsville at the time at Wabash College, and I still remember the release of the first Beatles albums. And as each one was released in sequence, I would make my way to Target and try to buy each Beatles album along the way, and on CD now. And slowly build up a collection of, I think I have most, I don't know that I have every one, but I have most of the Beatles albums on CD now.
Do you have any personal stories about listening to their music, films, TV appearances, concerts?
I never got to go to a concert. I've seen replays of some of their, well, I never got to go to a concert when I was a kid. Let me clear up, not an actual Beatles concert. About 4 years ago, I did have the opportunity to go see Paul McCartney live here in Indianapolis with you, Maria, and with your sisters, and that was a great concert. I think we all enjoyed it. Claire is a huge Beatles fan and has been basically since high school, and it was a lot of fun to see him in concert for the first time in my life, and he did a great job despite being 70 plus years old. He still does a great job in concert. I do remember I actually wrote an English report during the year that I lived in the United Kingdom. In my English composition class, actually wrote a report on what the whole meaning of the song Eleanor Rigby was. I wish I still had that. I could share it with you, but I think I did pretty well on that report as I remember. But that was a lot of fun. There's a lot of deep meaning in that song, as there is in many of the Beatles songs.
How did your family and friends react to the Beatles?
I don't remember specifically. I know my brother Scott, who's 3 years younger, kind of became a Beatles fan at the same time I did when we lived in the United Kingdom. I don't remember really talking about the Beatles much to my parents. My dad never really was big at listening to music. He listened mostly to news on the radio. So most of our introduction to music came through our mom, who would occasionally take us and let us buy a 45, which at the time, one of these was about $1 to get a song. It's funny, they were $1 back then, and I remember that. Now you can basically get a song for 99 cents or a little over $1 on iTunes. So the price of a song hasn't changed much. It's just the difference between buying a piece of plastic or vinyl and now buying something online. But that's kind of what I remember of my family's connection with and friends' connection with the Beatles.
How did the Beatles impact your life at school, work, and home?
I think I've already probably hit on most of that, particularly how it impacted my life at school. I try to remember what actually caused me to to become so interested in the Beatles during my junior year of high school. But I think it was likely, as I think back, the fact that we had Ringo Starr's stepdaughter riding on the bus with us, and an awareness of that, and that combined with music that was popular at the time, and many artists at the time talking about how they were so inspired by the Beatles. Really, as I said, I think it was the start of the next generation listening to the Beatles, and it's been so rewarding then watching my own daughters become huge Beatles fans. And as I know in the car, I would say about half the time we're listening to music on an iPhone or an iPad. You guys have the Beatles on, and so it's kind of fun to watch yet now another generation, a third generation, and in some cases a fourth generation start to listen to Beatles music.
What impact does the Beatles music have on your life today?
I don't know that it has a direct impact. I like to listen to music. I could listen to some of their songs over and over, and they never get old. And they're relaxing. They make you think of a time. They were kind of Elvis and then the Beatles were many references being the kind of introduction to pop and rock music as we know it today, and but their music is timeless, I guess, and that's why I enjoy listening to it. There's so many songs that are a fad, and they go away, and you never listen to them again, and may never ever hear them again. But the Beatles will go on for generations.
How did you react to the Beatles changing style and then their ultimate breakup?
Well, I wasn't paying much attention when the breakup occurred. So as I look back on it, it's sad that they broke up when they did. But listen, that's been the case with so many popular groups over time, and we got some good things out of the Beatles breakup. I think the formation of Wings and the success of Paul McCartney and Wings, again, was a primary example of something good that came out of the breakup. But there was a lot of friction, at least as I understand it, between the Beatles toward the end there, and as a part of their breakup. A lot of stories about them being riddled with drug problems, and that's kind of sad for a group that was so popular but so common also for the time, I think, and even today, that people reach that high point in stardom and then succumb to other issues, substance abuse, etc. So that part was sad. I do remember where I was. I think as I recall, I was in Franklin, Indiana, the day that John Lennon was shot. I think a lot of us remember where we were. Again, that was before I went to the United Kingdom and became such a fan of the Beatles, but I knew enough about them. It was such a big news story that most of us remember where we were, and that's what I remember of that day.
In your opinion, why do you think the Beatles became so famous and still are?
Their music, I guess, had a deep meaning. They ushered in a new era of pop music. It's hard to identify. You listen to the difference between 50s music and then the Beatles, and they brought a completely different style that survives today. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, was really the predecessor of today's rock and pop music. So I think the difference in their style, obviously, for a cross section of teenage females, this all boy, essentially all boy rock band was very popular, as some of the all boy rock bands have been more recently. But I think the introduction and widespread use of TV and at the time also helped spread their popularity globally. They became one of the first major groups to really get worldwide exposure, at least as best I can tell, and appear on so many big shows around the world. We all remember and talk about the Ed Sullivan Show here in the U.S., which was really their U.S. debut, and that's the one we always see the replays of. So I think that's what I think about why they became so popular.
Do you have a favorite Beatle?
Paul McCartney, without question. I think actually my personal view is that Paul was the best vocalist of the Beatles. Of course, they weren't all lead vocalists anyway, but I think when it comes to the vocals, I appreciate most Paul's vocal ability. John Lennon was good, but I think Paul was just a better vocalist in my mind, and it seems that most of the songs that I really enjoy, he was the lead vocalist for, and then I enjoyed Wings as well.
So what was Beatlemania?
Well, I don't know what the official definition is, but I think it's the craze that hit particularly the teenage female population that caused, almost a ruckus at many of their concerts. And that when I hear the term Beatlemania, it's that the world just went nuts. But particularly the teenage females of the time, and that helped generate the popularity that the Beatles still see today.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.